Well, hello students. This is Professor Shlomo Levy, and it's my pleasure to record this video for you today on the causes of the American Civil War. I'm primarily recording this video for my online students so that I can show them what I'm emphasizing with students on campus. But my campus students are welcome to watch it as well, just in case you were absent on the day that I went through this, or if you're preparing for an exam and you want to go over it again and see what I'm emphasizing. In all of my classes, I encourage students to focus on the assigned readings, whether you're reading the Brinkley text or whether you're reading the American Civil War and my Civil War seminar, or even if you're reading This Terrible Ordeal by James McPherson. Any of the texts that you're using goes through this material, some of them in great detail. And of course, I recommend all the videos that I recommend in Blackboard, as well as the historical documents. What I'm going to do here is take you through what I think are the most important facts and concepts to know about the causes of the American Civil War. Perhaps I'll go a little faster than I normally do in class, but I will pause at different points to allow you to think about what we're talking about and what we're covering so all this can sink in. Also, I want to remind all of my students, whether you're studying with me online or on campus, that you're all welcome to stop by my office hours, which are posted at the top of your syllabus, and you can come by there without an appointment, and we can talk one-on-one and help answer or clarify any questions that you may have. And in that case, I do ask the students come with a list of questions so that I can answer them quickly and specifically. And you also have access to the Learning Center, where they have some very good history tutors available for you there as well. So let's look more closely at the causes of the American Civil War. First, let's put the Civil War into some context or perspective, because in many of my courses, and if you've studied American history, you've studied a lot of wars, from the American Revolution through the War of 1812, the French and Indian War, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, World War I, World War II. So there are all these wars. So it's possible that in studying all these wars, it starts to become a blur, or you really can't tell the difference between, how important one war was versus another. So I just wanted to put it into perspective, particularly for today's students. If you think about America's current and most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, over 5,000 American soldiers have died in those conflicts over the last 20 years. Well, to put that into perspective, compare that to the American Civil War that we're studying now, which had over 700,000 casualties. Okay, so it is difference in magnitude. As a matter of fact, the American Civil War saw more American casualties than in the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all of America's wars combined. That is how many people died in the American Civil War. So it is the most important and most defining war in American history. Part of that is because every casualty counted as an American casualty. It's also different because in many of our other wars, we're fighting people of different nationalities, fighting the Germans or fighting the Japanese. We're fighting people in different locations, people with different religions, different languages. But in the Civil War, it is Americans killing each other, Americans fighting each other. It is a civil war. And that also makes it different from any other war that we fought. And so that is important and something for us to keep in mind as we look at it. So what causes a nation to turn against itself? That's the fundamental problem or fundamental question in understanding the Civil War, and that's why people are so fascinated about it. There are more books and movies made about the Civil War than in any other event. in American history. And this partly because of that question to understand ourselves and how did we get to this point. So how did we get there? Let us take a step back and review how we got to this point. We know that there had always been what I call here long-standing moral objections to the issue of slavery, which is the central conflict in this war. But slavery is not a new issue. So why did it erupt in the 1850s to the point of war? If we think about it, you've always had organizations who wanted to end slavery in different ways, starting with the American Colonization Society, formed way back in 1817. And their goal was to free the slaves and then send them back to Africa, to relocate them. And this was a serious idea. In the early 19th century, Congress actually allocated $100,000 in 1819 and purchased land or helped establish a place in Africa, creating the country of Liberia, which is why it was called Monrovia after President James Monroe. And they actually succeeded in relocating about 11,000 people. It was just a fraction of the black population. By 1860, there were almost 4 million people of African descent here. So it was never successful, but that was one of the ideas. Then in the 1830s, the abolitionists, the American Anti-Slavery Society, really gets formed and they start to become very active. And these are the people we normally refer to as abolitionists. But it was an actual organization with members and supporters. Incidentally, Abraham Lincoln never joined the American Anti-Slavery Society, although he said in one speech that he was as opposed to slavery as any abolitionist. But he thought they were too radical. And what they wanted to end slavery immediately. And they wanted African Americans to have equal citizenship. And so some people thought that they were too radical. And then you had individuals working in small groups and sometimes individually on what was called the Underground Railroad. That wasn't a physical railroad, but it was a network of people and individuals who would help slaves escape by hiding them in their basements, in their barns, in their churches, and helping them get from one location to the next until they ultimately made it to a free state or made it into Canada. So these, opposition to slavery had always been there. What we see is that the issue of slavery escalates in importance. In other words, it becomes more divisive as time goes on through the decades. And so we see this as the result or consequences of the failure to deal with these issues at other and earlier points in history. One of those key points was at the Constitutional Convention. So after we got our independence from Great Britain, this was an opportunity to start over again, to start anew, to decide what kind of country we want this to be. And the issue of slavery was debated there at the Constitutional Convention. There were people, as we talk about American History 1, who wanted to abolish slavery entirely. You had people like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton who were strongly opposed to slavery. But to get the inclusion, participation, and support of the Southern states, they embedded in the Constitution a provision called the 3/5 Compromise that I have on the screen here. And what this provision did is it established our democracy, our Republican form of democracy, in such a way that Southern states were allowed to count 3/5 of the enslaved population and add that total to the total white population of the state. And this in turn would give them more congressmen. More congressmen means they have more electoral votes, because electoral votes is the number of congressmen plus the number of senators, which means they have more power and influence in electing presidents. And this gave them a disproportionate influence in American government beyond their actual numbers. That is, if you just counted the white population of the North and the white population of the South and excluded black people who were not allowed to vote anyway, then the South would have much less political power. And so this, preserving slavery and allowing Southern states not only to continue slavery, but to actually benefit from it politically. And so this was a concession that northern states made at the Constitutional Convention. They would come to regret it almost immediately in the 1800 election, where Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams. And they calculated that if you had only counted the white vote in the 1800 election, John Adams would have won. And so from that point on, the North resented this and felt it was an unfair advantage that the South was deriving by counting people who they considered their property, not people at all, not people who would have any constitutional rights or the right to vote, but to give them additional power. Then you see political parties form. This is a third party that's important for you to know about because it didn't last very long, but it was called the Free Soil Party, and this is the 1840s. And as we'll see, as the country is expanding geographically, actually getting bigger, doubling and then tripling in size from what it was at the time of the American Revolution, the future of what the country would be. And the Free Soil Party, established in 1848, wanted to stop the spread of slavery any further west. In other words, to say that the southern states that we already have as slave states, we'll keep them, and no one is trying to abolish slavery in those states, but we don't want it to spread any further. And so that party was called the Free Soil Party. It's called free because they wanted it to be free of slavery. Actually, they didn't even want free black people moving there either. And the reason they opposed it is they saw the South as a region of the country where wherever slavery exists, then opportunities for white people who work for a salary diminish. This is why the North is growing rapidly in population, both through natural increase, people having babies and increasing, but also because of migration and immigration. Large numbers of immigrants from Ireland and Germany, from all over the world, moving to the United States. And when they moved to the United States, they did not settle in the South to a large extent. They settle in northern areas because there they can find jobs. People will hire them and pay them to work in factories, to work in mines, to work in shops and stores. And so there are opportunities for white people and white immigrants in northern states that don't exist in southern states, because in those southern states they have slaves doing most of the work. So this is important. It creates a whole political party, very popular in the 1840s, and as we'll see in just a moment, it will become one of the elements in the creation of the new Republican Party. As we move on, when we look at this territorial expansion, this is something, again, I want students to appreciate and understand, because from your perspective today, when I say the United States, you think of almost the entire North American continent, which is what it is today. But it wasn't that way in the 18th and 19th century. And so, starting with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and I'm going to show you a map in just a moment, this doubles the size of the United States. And then in 1820, Missouri, part of that new territory, is going to want to become a state in the United States. And this brings about competing visions of American society. The North wanted a society that favored white workers. I'm putting it that way, as opposed to saying or thinking incorrectly that the North was a region of abolitionists. That is incorrect. There were abolitionists. They were always a minority of people in the North. But the majority of Northerners wanted a society that favored white workers. So their opposition to slavery is very much self-motivated. It is self-interested. The limiting of slavery is good for people who work for a salary, right? And this is their main objection, not because of what slavery does to black people. People who are concerned about the immorality of slavery, the injustice of slavery, they are called abolitionists. But the growing opposition in the North is largely economic. The South wanted a society based on slave labor. Even though this disadvantaged white workers in the South, the support for slavery, even though it was against the economic interests of working class white people, they so much identify with the ruling class of planters. It also provided them not so much economic advantages as much as social status as being white in a section of the country where there are black people. So it derives, kind of identity of white society. They feel it's our society, but this is why the South supports slavery, even though, as you'll see in a moment, very few of the Southerners actually own slaves. These two competing visions are going to clash all through the early 19th century. Now, this map helps clarify what I've just been talking about for those of you who are geographically challenged. On the right side of the map, I would have used more contrasting colors, but the light gray shows the free states, dark gray are slave states. And you can see that there's almost an equilibrium between the number of slave and free states. But then in 1803, with the Louisiana Purchase, you see here in the center, this doubles the size of the country. Everything from the Gulf of Mexico down here all the way up to current day Canada becomes a part of the United States. And all of this territory is going to be carved into states. So right now it's territory, but they're going to be carved into states. And as each one becomes a state, it threatens to alter the balance of power between the northern and southern regions. And this becomes evident first with the admission of Missouri here in the center in 1820. It becomes a state in 1821, but in 1820, when it applies for statehood, to actually become a state, because once a territory becomes a state under our Constitution, it automatically gets 2 senators and it gets a number of congressmen proportional to the population. Right? So this is why every new state changes the math and changes the balance of power. And so when Missouri applied for statehood, the debate in Congress was, will Missouri come in as a free state or will it enter as a slave state? Now, Thomas Jefferson was still alive at this point, and he said this was like ringing a fire bell in the middle of the night. Right? Basically, oh my God. If the states are going to start debating and arguing about whether they're going to admit any more slave states, then this is a signal of trouble in the future for the United States. But you see the North raising more objection and more opposition, not to the existing slave states, but to the addition of any new slave states. In this case, Missouri will come in as a slave state. Later, and I'll explain this in just a moment as well, after the Mexican-American War, they will see areas like Texas and California. All of this will also ultimately become a part of the United States, and the same issue, the same debate, and the same conflict is going to emerge. So you see what I'm saying, how this issue won't go away, and not only won't it disappear, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and more important in affecting the balance of power in Congress and in society. Now, the Mexican-American War is a war that is significant in part because how the Mexican-American War leads to the Civil War. Right? It is a part of this growing American feeling of preeminence that is best described by the historical term manifest destiny. That's what I have on the slide here, and what most of the textbooks describe as manifest destiny. Manifest meaning is coming into being, destiny meaning is fate, it's determined, almost by God, that it is, in a sense, God's will that the United States ultimately conquer all of North America. And with this, we will acquire from Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Wyoming and Colorado and Texas. This whole western part of the country will come into being. Abraham Lincoln is in Congress during the Mexican-American War, and he opposed the war, along with many of the Whig party members. He was a member of the Whig Party at that time. And they saw it as a naked land grab, that it wasn't a war of self-defense. It was a desire to get more land, and that particularly Southerners wanted this land so they could expand agriculture in that area, and also that this would lead to further expansion of slavery. And so this is why they opposed it. One key person that is mentioned in the textbook that I want to emphasize here was a Pennsylvania congressman by the name of David Wilmot. He was a congressman who started as a Democrat. He was a supporter of the Mexican-American War in general, and he supported President Polk, who was president at the time and a Democrat. But he introduced a bill in Congress to fund the Mexican-American War, and he tried to insert a provision saying that any land that we should get from Mexico cannot be used for slavery. That if we do get this territory, all that territory I showed you in the West, that slaves cannot go there. People from the South can move there if they want and buy land, acquire land, have farms, raise cattle, but they cannot introduce or bring slaves with them. Abraham Lincoln voted for this, even though he's of the opposing party, and many people assumed that David Wilmot was some kind of closet abolitionist. And then he gave a speech in which he explained that he did not introduce that bill because he's opposed to slavery. He said he was doing this to help the white citizens of Pennsylvania. How does this help white people in Pennsylvania to stop slaves from moving into California or into Texas? Right? Well, this is part of the whole westward migration of people going west by covered wagon. They're going west on horseback. They're going west by train as the Transcontinental Railroad is being built. And in the 19th century, Americans saw the Western Territory as the future of the country, as the land of opportunity, as the Northeast becomes congested and fewer opportunities, that people, particularly young people, could go west and they could get a new start there. And what David Wilmot was saying is he doesn't want people from Pennsylvania to have to compete with slave labor if they move west. Because if Southerners also move west, they'll have slaves doing most of the work. And if that happens, there won't be many opportunities for white people who expect to work for a salary. From a military point of view, it's important to note that most of the generals that we'll be talking about during the Civil War were junior officers in the Mexican-American War. So they all knew each other. They had previously served with each other on the same army during the Mexican-American War. Generals like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant, Stonewall Jackson, they were all fighting in the Mexican-American War. Not only that, many of them were graduates of West Point. Robert E. Lee was the commandant of West Point. General McClellan graduated near the top of his class from West Point. So these are military people who went to school with each other, who fought for the United States together wearing the blue uniform in the Mexican-American War, are now fighting against each other in the Civil War. They know each other. That's why it says different from like World War II, where you're fighting the Germans or the Japanese. They know the generals on the opposing side. They know their names. They went to school with them. They served with them. And it is brother against brother in this war. Now, there are political efforts to try to prevent the escalation of this conflict from erupting into all-out war, and all of those efforts failed. And this is why you have the Compromise of 1820, and here we're talking about the Compromise of 1850. This is after the Mexican-American War, and as Congress is deciding the fate of the states that will enter, the biggest and most important of those states was California, because of its rich agriculture and because gold was discovered there in the 1840s, creating the whole gold rush of people going out to California to get gold. This was the biggest prize, and the outcome of that had to be decided by Congress. And in this case, Congress decided that California would enter the Union as a free state. So you see the North becoming more adamant in its opposition to slavery. And so, 30 years earlier, they said, all right, we'll let you have Missouri. And this is the last, slave state. We're going to let you have everything above 3630. When that comes in, that it has to be a free territory. But California, they refused to give in. They refused to give in like they did in the 3/5 Compromise in the Constitutional Convention, like they did in 1820. And here, the North said, no, California is coming in as a free state. And the South was very unhappy about that. And you see the resentment building as they feel like, well, we fought, many of us, like Robert E. Lee, we fought in the Mexican-American War, and now you're telling us we can't move there? And we shed blood to get this land from Mexico, and now we can't move there with their slaves. So the South feels an injustice that they're being restricted and that they're being limited in as to where they can go in America with their slaves. One plan that was proposed was called the idea of popular sovereignty. So it was getting very controversial in Washington debating these issues. And so one idea, as I have on the slide here, is called popular sovereignty. And what that means is that each territory would hold an election, and they would decide for themselves if they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. Congress supported this idea because it would hopefully get the issue of slavery out of Congress and let the people who live in those territories decide. But as we'll see, that didn't work because of voter intimidation, of primarily pro-slavery people with their guns attacking abolitionists, but then also some abolitionists like John Brown who would go down and kill pro-slavery people. And this made the results of those elections very uncertain in terms of what people actually wanted. So settling it locally did not work. The other concern Southern states had is if you start creating free states to the north and to the west, then slaves could escape in either direction. They could either escape to the north, as they have been doing on the Underground Railroad, or they could escape to the west as another alternative, since there are free states now in the west. And so again, to appease the South, Congress passed a law called the Federal Fugitive Slave Law, the Federal Fugitive Slave Law. And this was a promise to the South that the federal government would be more active in capturing and returning escaped people. So if people escape, like Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist you're reading about, when he gets to New York, he lived the rest of his life as a free man. Or if they got to Massachusetts, or Philadelphia was the biggest center of freed people. So if you made it to Philadelphia, then you would be free. And it was difficult for slave catchers or bounty hunters to apprehend people in those states, particularly northern states that by the 1850s, most of the northern states have abolished slavery on their own, starting with Pennsylvania, abolished slavery in 1780. And then many of them had personal liberty laws that made it illegal to try to force someone to go with you against their will. That would be kidnapping. So if you were a slave and you made it to Pennsylvania and a slave catcher tried to capture you and bring you back to slavery, then local authorities might intervene, as they had in some cases. And there were cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court, a case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, where the Supreme Court said that Pennsylvania could not interfere with these private bounty hunters. But they did not have to assist or help them capture escaped people who were living in their states. And so under the federal fugitive laws of 1850, the federal government was supposed to help catch and return enslaved people. And this made it very difficult and challenging for people after 1850. As a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass had to leave the country and go to England because the risk of capture for him was too great. But this doesn't really mollify the South in their anger and their feeling that the country is turning against them and turning against slavery. And it also had the opposite effect in those northern states. So Harriet Beecher Stowe writes her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. It comes out in book form in 1852, and before that it appeared serially as episodes that would come out in magazines every month, and people would have to wait for the next installment. But the idea of slave catchers and bounty hunters in the North capturing free people further turned the North against slavery. The anti-slavery sentiment in the North got even stronger because of this. So if this was supposed to, lessen opposition to slavery, it had the opposite consequence, so that more people are opposed to it for moral reasons, and people are opposed to it for economic reasons. This map, I think, shows you more clearly what I've just tried to explain. Here you can see this black line in the center, the Missouri line. So Missouri is right here. As I said, they allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state, which is why it's yellow on this map. But this black line represents 3630 longitude and latitude. And what they had agreed in 1820 is that anything above this line, anything above 3630 longitude and latitude, if it ever applied for statehood, it would automatically be free. So all this, you see, unorganized territory, which would be, North Dakota, South Dakota, all of these states here, that when they become states, they would automatically have to be free. Right? They would automatically. So we're not going to have a debate every time like we did with Missouri. And by the way, to balance off Missouri, we brought in the state of Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, just maintain the equilibrium. So we brought in a slave state, then we balanced that off by bringing in a free state. But the Missouri Compromise said no more slave states above 3630 longitude and latitude. And this again is going to ensure that the North is growing faster. Not only the North, but I should say at this point, the number of free states start to greatly outnumber the number of slave states. So when we get to the Civil War and fighting breaks out, there are 36 states in the country by that point. 22 of those states are free states against 11 slave states. And not only are there more states, there are many more people who live in free states. And so we see how slavery is actually hurting the South, not only economically, it's retarding it from developing industrially, but also it doesn't benefit as much from immigration. So free people coming from Ireland, coming from Germany, coming from all over Europe, they settle in free states. And that is going to mean when the war breaks out that the North and free states have so many more people, as well as many more states. And we see Kansas and Nebraska. Now again, if you look at that map, Kansas and Nebraska are clearly above the 3630 line of longitude and latitude. So that should have automatically been a free territory. Now these came in as separate states, Kansas and Nebraska as separate states. One idea was they would be one territory or one state. But this debate brought Lincoln out of retirement. So he had served just one term in Congress, just 2 years in the 1840s, and then had gone back to practicing law as a private citizen. And when the debate over Kansas and Nebraska came up, people in the North said, foul, this is automatically supposed to be free territory. We agreed on that way back in 1820, and now the South is trying to reintroduce slavery into the territories under this provision of what I call popular sovereignty. And as I said, those votes in those states were controversial, and the politics in those territories were marred by violence on both sides. Abolition and pro-slavery people poured into the state, and people like John Brown, I'll talk about in a moment, fought back, and this was controversial. So this threw the issue really back to Congress to decide and for Congress to solve. let's stop for a moment and think about all that we've learned and everything that I've said so far. And see if you understand, if you've been grasping, or for those of you watching this as a video, how closely are you paying attention? So let's do a little in-class quiz here. What was the most important cause of the Civil War? Was it A, states' rights? You hear that argument sometimes that the South was fighting for states' rights. Did we see any rights of southern states being taken away so far? No. Did we see any people talking about their right as individual states? Was it the expansion of slavery? Was it the desire for racial equality? The equality of all the races? Was it northern aggression of the North attacking the South? Or was it the election of Abraham Lincoln? Which of these do you think was the most important cause of the Civil War? You may have some contributing factors, you may have some that are the consequences, but what is the most important, most significant cause of the Civil War? Give you a minute to answer that. Everybody got that? What did you say? Okay, so the expansion of slavery. That's all what I've been talking about, and with all of these maps and charts to show you that it is the expansion of slavery that is the most important cause. Okay, if you think about where the country is by the first year of the Civil War in 1860, there were 8 million whites in the South, 4 million slaves. They were a majority in some states like South Carolina. They were almost 40% of states like Virginia. But of those, according to the 1860 census, only about 384,000 whites reported owning any slaves. Or to put that another way, maybe easier way to think about it, 75%, 3/4 of the white population of the South owned no slaves. Okay, so if they don't own any slaves, and the reason so few white people in the South own slaves is by 1860, slaves were very expensive. An average adult male slave could cost as much as $1,000 for a young male slave. $1,000 was more than the average white worker made in a year in 1860, right? So for most people, buying slaves was beyond their income, beyond their means. And of course, one slave wouldn't really do you any good. You have to own hundreds of acres of land and, having hundreds of slaves working that land. So only the top 12% of the population owned 20 slaves or more. The top 12%. The bottom 90% own no or few slaves. The top 10% of the South own most of the land and they own most of the slaves. So these facts are important to understand. Well, then what's motivating the South? When we look at, Civil War battles, why are those soldiers fighting? Those Confederate soldiers, when we know that most of them didn't even own any slaves. So it's like, well, I'm out here, the North is trying to take my slaves away from me. You don't even own any slaves. Why are you out there fighting? Right? But there was a kind of racial solidarity and regional solidarity that even though they themselves didn't own any slaves, they felt bound to the system and the culture. It's our way of life, they would say, in the plural. Our way of life. Our peculiar institution, a lot of these euphemisms for slavery. And this number is going down as time goes on. More people own slaves in the 1830s than in the 1860s. Right? So that means wealth is concentrating at the top. Right? And poverty and less opportunity is growing at the bottom. But still, the South held together. This is one reason why West Virginia will break away from Virginia at the start of the Civil War. Virginia will secede and join the South, and then the western part of the state, the Appalachian mountainous regions where people don't own as many slaves, they broke away. They seceded from the seceding southern state to rejoin the Union. So that it's mostly, in areas of the country where slave ownership is high, and those who own most of the land and own most of the slaves also have most of the political power. And so they made the decisions for the entire South. But they have vested interests in that. Other people I'll talk about briefly are important black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. This is a picture of him as an older man. But he was important for the moral crusade against slavery because he was born a slave in Maryland. He escaped. He learned to read and write. He joined the American Anti-Slavery Society, abolitionist movement, and he wrote a book called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, where for the first time he explained in his own words what it was really like to be a slave, right? And for the first time, a lot of people in the North who didn't know, they have minstrel shows and things that always showed black people in these theaters laughing and happy and dancing, that was one perception that they had of slavery. But he talked about the brutality of it, the harshness of it, and humanized enslaved people. And this helped shift and change public opinion. And then he became an outspoken orator. And his relationship with Abraham Lincoln in particular had a profound influence on Lincoln for him to be able to meet intelligent black people like Frederick Douglass. Also changed his opinions and perceptions in many ways. This is a picture of Frederick Douglass, his home outside of Washington, D.C., a place called Anacostia. I have some video from there as well. He started a newspaper called the Northern Star. He was a feminist. He was at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where the women's movement gets started. A lot of those women were also abolitionists, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott. And so they were all part of this kind of progressive movement to end slavery and then to get rights for women as well. He helped with the Freedmen's Bank after the Civil War, became an ambassador basically to Haiti. And this was his second wife, Mary Helen Pitts, which caused a lot of controversy when he married her in 1884 because she was a white woman. And so the kind of racial tensions of that. This is a photograph of William Lloyd Garrison, a white man who was the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So that organization was largely an organization of white progressives, of which you had prominent African Americans as individuals like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and others, but it was largely an organization, a movement of white progressives. They were committed to the immediate abolition of slavery, not for sending black people to Africa, but that they are Americans and should have the same rights as other American citizens. Some of them initially thought that the Constitution, because it permitted slavery, was a compact with slavery, a compact with death, and they thought it would have to be changed. And indeed, after the Civil War, they would amend it with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but they were very unhappy with the Constitution as it existed at that time. People like Sojourner Truth, again, an enslaved woman from New York, not from the South. She was a New York slave. New York was one of the largest slave-owning states in the North until it abolished slavery in the 1820s. And through her life, we see, the experiences of enslaved women. You notice here she was sold several times in her life, and you see how her price increases once she reaches her childbearing years. So after puberty, the ability to produce children, they become more valuable as property because people are property, and property is wealth. And the different ways that slaves would try to escape. This is a story of a man named Henry Box Brown. He got the nickname Box because he mailed himself with the help of abolitionists from Virginia to Philadelphia. They mailed him in a box that was 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. He was 5'8". They put on their farm equipment and mailed him from Virginia to Philadelphia. And when he came out of the box, they called him Henry Box Brown. By the way, Frederick Douglass was very upset with Box Brown for publishing this and writing a book about how he escaped, because he said if you let them know the various ways that abolitionists help slaves escape, then they'll start checking the boxes and opening the crates more thoroughly. So he's supposed to keep those methods and means secret. But they had different ways that they were doing that, and that's all part of the Underground Railroad. John Brown, he's an important catalyst, and for those of you who've been watching the documentary that I could recommend, Ken Burns, The Civil War, excellent documentary. You can find it online many places. I have a link to it in Blackboard. But John Brown was a white man from Connecticut. He joined the abolitionists, but you have to remember that in the 1840s and 50s, the abolitionists were committed to ending slavery non-violently, through persuasion, through voting, through petitions and speeches, to persuade people to give up their slaves. John Brown believed that violence might be necessary. And he would have these visions from God. He said he was like Gideon, God's instrument, God's sword, and he would lead this holy war to end slavery in the United States. And so after an abolitionist was killed in Kansas named Elijah Lovejoy, they murdered him and threw his printing press into the river. John Brown said, we got to fight fire with fire. We have to take up our arms and swords, and we have to go out and fight these pro-slavery people. And so he, and with many of his sons, he had like 12 sons, they go to Kansas, and they encounter some pro-slavery people in a place called Potawatomi Creek. And they have their guns, but they use their swords to dismember their bodies. And then he becomes a wanted man. And his plan in 1859 was that he would lead a band of fighters to a place called Harper's Ferry in Virginia, where there was an armory. An armory is where the military keeps its weapons. And they would capture those weapons. And the plan was to then go through the South, arming the slaves and starting an insurrection, starting a slave revolt. That was the plan. He did make it into the armory, but then he was surrounded, captured by none other than Robert E. Lee as a Union officer wearing the blue Union uniform. And he arrives at Harper's Ferry. With him are people like Stonewall Jackson as a Union officer, and John Wilkes Booth, who would assassinate Lincoln. All these Union officers, and they arrest Brown. He's tried and convicted, and before he's executed from the gallows, he passes a note and asks him, do you have any final words before we kill you? And his last words were that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. And so even though his revolt failed, he died convinced that the only way slavery would ever end in the United States is with blood. And this may be prophetic because the next year Lincoln is elected, and then the Civil War begins, and as I said, 700,000 Americans will die. The Supreme Court failed to adequately deal with the issue, particularly in a case called the Dred Scott case of 1857. Here's a portrait you see of Dred Scott. He was born a slave to a man named Dr. John Emerson in Missouri. But Emerson was a doctor who traveled to different military bases in particular. And so for a while they lived in Illinois, a free state, and they also lived in Wisconsin, another free state. And he argued that once we moved into these free territories, that he became a free man. That slavery is only permitted in the slave states. And once you move into a free state, under the laws of those states or territories, slavery is not permitted. And so he gained his freedom. So when he died and Dr. Emerson's wife tried to claim him as her property, he fought in court. And he filed a lawsuit in the St. Louis court and won. And the judge ruled in his favor. Then the family appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they won. And the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1857, the court ruled against Dred Scott. The Chief Justice in that case, Justice Roger B. Taney, it should be Taney, Justice Roger B. Taney, he said in his opinion, quote, "A black man has no rights that a white man need respect." So that the Constitution didn't apply to them, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to black people. And so it really questioned even Congress's ability to try to limit where people can go with their property anywhere in the United States. So it really threw into question the whole legality of the Missouri Compromise, whether the federal government could tell people you can't go into a free territory or a free state with your slaves, because if you do, then those people become free once they enter your state. Well, this, the potential of this decision would mean that even in the North, where the people in those states have abolished slavery, that they may not be legally able to prevent Southerners from moving there with their slaves if it's their property. Right? And so this raised the specter for people in the North that slavery could in fact return to the North, even though state law says that you can't own a slave in this state, that federal law may permit it. And so the North became even more anxious and worried about the further spread of slavery, that slavery might return. So you see, this issue is escalating, not diminishing, even after the Supreme Court case. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln says the Supreme Court was just wrong in how it decided this case. And so it galvanizes energy in the North. I'm just going to go a little faster here. As I said, this was a controversial issue within Congress, and it came to blows. I mean, it came to the point where congressmen and senators couldn't even talk about this issue without them physically coming to blows. Here is an artist's depiction of an actual attack that took place between Preston Brooks, who was a congressman from South Carolina, who walked across the Capitol and attacked Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts as he sat at his desk in the United States Capitol, in the Senate, and beat him brutally. He was in the hospital, never fully recovered from his wounds. And he beat him for giving a speech in which he criticized slavery. So this just shows you how bad things got in Congress. I mean, if you think congressmen and senators and Democrats and Republicans are always fighting now, I mean, they were literally fighting in the 1850s. After this, congressmen and senators would wear, little Dillinger pistols and daggers just in case a fight broke out in Congress. And so you see all of our political institutions breaking down: the Supreme Court, Congress, within the states, and we're getting closer and closer to war. In 1856, a new party will be created, and that party is called the Republican Party. The Republican Party. The same Republican Party that we have today. And the one thing that all the members of the Republican Party had in common at that time was their opposition to slavery. Many of them were former members of the Free Soil Party that we talked about earlier. Some of them were anti-slavery Democrats who then left the Democratic Party because it was so pro-slavery. Some of them were anti-slavery Whigs, like Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party. And some of them were abolitionists who had their own party called the Liberty Party. They could never get a lot of people elected. And so all these elements came together to form the Republican Party in 1856. Many of them did it for economic reasons, of territorial expansion, of slavery, and some of them did it for moral reasons. But whatever their motive, they came together and they created this new party in 1856, committed to stopping the expansion of slavery into the Western Territory. Not, for most of them, for the purpose of abolishing slavery in the southern states. This is an important distinction. Even though we know that's going to happen as a result of the Civil War, it was not the goal of the Republican Party initially to destroy slavery where it already existed, but to stop it from moving to places where it did not yet exist in the West. This is an important distinction and something to understand about the Republican Party at that time. Now, Lincoln becomes the first Republican president. They did run a candidate in 1856 who lost, Fremont, but then they regrouped in 1860, and they decide on this man, Abraham Lincoln, as their candidate. Here I have the Lincoln-Douglas debate. This is from 1858. Before he ran for president, he tried to run for the United States Senate from the state of Illinois, his adopted state. He was born in Kentucky, but he moved to Illinois and adopted that as his home state. And he tried to become a senator there against Stephen Douglas, the incumbent senator, and he lost that race. But he did so well against Douglas that it brought him to the attention of the Republican Party. And so they selected him as their candidate. There's a great book by Doris Kearns Goodwin called Team of Rivals. It's been made into a movie by Steven Spielberg called Lincoln. Recommend both of them, which describes the politics and machinations of how he got the nomination. And he wasn't well known nationally, Abraham Lincoln. He only served 2 years in Congress back in the 1840s, so very few people outside Illinois knew who he was or even knew his name. But he was from what we would call today a swing state, from the Midwest, right? So the Republican Party knew they would lose the South. Again, think this is the Republican Party of the 19th century. Today, the Republican Party is very strong in the South among red states. But in the 19th century, they didn't win any southern states. Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. So they knew they would lose the South. They would win many states in the North. And so the outcome would depend on how these Midwestern states, how they went. And so this is why the Republican Party leaders felt it would help their chances if they chose a candidate from the Midwest, as opposed to some of the better known candidates in the Republican Party at that time, like William Stewart and others, who were prominent Democrats from north and northeastern states. And so this is one of the reasons why they choose Lincoln. He was totally self-educated. And I know that's hard to believe when you read his speeches, the Gettysburg Address, the first inaugural address, the second inaugural address in 1865. When you read his letters, he was so literate, so eloquent. He was as good a writer as Thomas Jefferson, but he was totally self-educated. When he got to Congress in the 1840s, they asked him to fill out a survey, and on that line where it says to describe your educational background, he wrote deficient, because he didn't go to college, he didn't go to law school, but yet he was able to become a lawyer. In the 19th century, if you studied and were able to pass the bar, then you could practice law. And so he was a self-starter, self-motivated, highly intelligent, and he's a good example for college students today to understand, the purpose of education is not just to get a degree so you can get a job so you can make more money, but to develop your mind. And that's what Lincoln was really about. As I mentioned, he served in Congress. He opposed the Mexican-American War. When he was in Congress, he offered a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, that is in Washington, D.C. Because Congress does have control over the District of Columbia. He knew the bill would never pass to end slavery nationally, but he thought Congress could do it in Washington, D.C., and he introduced that bill. Didn't pass, but he had gone on record as opposing slavery early on in his career. As I mentioned, he lost his Senate race in 1858, and yet 2 years later, he will become the 16th president of the United States. When he is elected, in 1860. He wins by 39.9% of the popular vote. I mention that because today we think of Lincoln as one of the most popular and possibly the greatest president in American history. Yet, during the times that he lived, he was not very popular at all. He won the election with just 39.9% of the popular vote and with no electoral votes from southern states. He says in his first inaugural address, and I strongly encourage for you to read the documents that I put in Blackboard, the primary documents. One of those includes his first inaugural speech as president. And when he takes the oath of office in March of 1861, so the election occurred in November of 1860, but in those days the newly elected president didn't take the oath of office until March. Now it's January 20th at noon. The new president is sworn in. But he didn't take the oath of office until March. By that point, by the time he actually takes the office of president, 7 southern states have already left the Union under James Buchanan and started their own country called the Confederate States of America. And in his first inaugural address, he says, really to the nation, speaking to the South, I know you've heard a lot of things about me and a lot of things about the Republican Party that has made you afraid and thinking we're going to try to abolish slavery. And he tries to assure them, he says in that, I have no inclination, nor do I have the legal authority to abolish slavery. So he's basically urging them to come back to the Union. He assures them, I'm not going to interfere with slavery where it already exists. And this is why he chooses his words very carefully. That is, in any southern state where slavery exists, Lincoln respects the right of those states to decide for themselves whether they want to be a slave state or a free state. But he says we must hold fast, as with a chain of iron, to make sure that slavery doesn't go into the territory. The legal distinction there for Lincoln is that states have autonomy and states do have certain rights that belong to states, but territories are federal land. They are not states, they are federal land, and therefore the federal government has complete control over federal land. And only the federal government can admit states into the United States. Right? So therefore this is completely within the proper jurisdiction of the federal government to deal with national federal issues. And that's an important legal distinction that they're making at that time. And so he won't actually move to abolish slavery until he issues the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years later in 1863. We'll talk more about that as we get to that point in the war, but as we give Lincoln's bio, that is very important. And then as he starts to move from just emancipation to granting citizenship to black people, this is when John Wilkes Booth, an actor who lives in Washington, said, we have to kill Lincoln. We have to kill him because he's already emancipated the slaves. Now he's going to make black people citizens and give them rights and allow them to vote. And so on April 15th, they assassinate him at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, Lincoln's views on race, as I have up here, are very complicated. And again, I provided a package of documents of private letters, particularly read that letter to his best friend Joshua Speed. Look at some of the speeches he made during his senatorial run for the United States Senate, where you see he expresses a variety of opinions on race. And we have to try to see how can we reconcile these seemingly contradictory points of view. For instance, he said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. Right? Very clear. He says, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. He says, he gives that at the Cooper Union speech in New York, right? That we can't continue to go on the way we have, half the country slave, half the country free. We're either going to be all one thing or all the other. And he said, I have always hated slavery, I think as much as any abolitionist. So although he wasn't himself an abolitionist, he said he hates slavery. Yet his best friend, Joshua Speed, is a slave owner. His wife, Mary Todd, comes from a slaveholding family. So he hates slavery, but he doesn't hate Southerners. Right? His best friend, his wife, he was born in Kentucky, a slave state, although he and his family never owned slaves. But it's not as though he hated people who did. He saw that as just difference of opinion. Yet he also said things like, on the right, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. Again, not in favor of the equality of black and white people. He went on to say, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. So Lincoln wasn't in favor of black people being allowed to vote or to be able to serve on juries, and he didn't believe in interracial relationships. And he said, there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. So, I asked students to figure out how can we reconcile Lincoln's seemingly contradictory points of view. On the one hand, saying slavery is wrong, we can't exist as a country that's half slave, half free, and I hate slavery, and introducing laws in Congress try to abolish slavery, and yet giving speeches like this. So this is something for you to think about. Lincoln is complicated. I also think that Lincoln evolves over time. Right? So people are capable of changing their mind, changing their opinions as new evidence exists. Then they reevaluate some of their previous prejudices and previous views. I would compare the issue of slavery and race to the way people's attitudes and opinions about human sexuality have changed over the last few years. About gay marriage and sexual identity. Many people who were opposed to these things 10 years ago now say, people should be allowed to marry whoever they want and be who they are, and, let people make their own choices and decisions when it comes to that. Well, that is a radical change in view within society, over, 10, 20 years. And so the same thing has happened with individuals and within our society on questions of race in terms of how people thought about things. In Lincoln's case, the same person, who said he's not in favor of black people being allowed to vote in 1857 will, by 1865, say, I'm in favor of the 14th Amendment, which will give black people the right to vote. It's like, how could you change your position? You said you weren't in favor of black people voting. Now you said you are. And so I think that maybe he evolved. Maybe his views changed over time. Certainly the Civil War itself helped that transformation take place. 160,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War for the Union. They were 10% of the Union Army by the end of the war, and they served very distinguished ways. And so Lincoln said those people have earned the right to be citizens. And then after he got to know people like Frederick Douglass, then his opinion about what black people were capable of doing changed for him. So, but Lincoln is complicated. When you look at the national divide, what this chart shows from 1848 to 1860 is that the political parties become more polarized, right? They become polarized by region. So when you had the Democratic and Whig Party in 1848, you see that there were almost as many Northern Democrats as there were Southern Democrats. There were almost as many Northern Whigs, or there were more, than Southern Whigs. By 1860, all the way on the right, you see that there are basically no Southern Republicans. The Republican Party is a Northern party. And there are very few Democrats in the North. The Democratic Party is largely a Southern party, or party of states. So the political divide becomes a regional divide. Republicans in the North, Democrats in the South. And that is going to be the break, in the national politics when we come to the Civil War. If you look at the electoral map of 1860, which I have up here, you can see clearly that Lincoln wins all of the north and northeastern states and California. The Democratic Party at the time is divided among themselves. The Southern Democrats go with a man named Breckinridge, and the Northern Democrats do go with Stephen Douglas. So the Democratic Party is split among themselves. I mean, if they were united, Lincoln still would have won, but still it shows the deep divisions even within the Democratic Party at the time. So Lincoln will win. As we move to conclusion, to understand the Confederate States of America, as I said initially, these are 7 southern states, starting with South Carolina as the first state to secede. It shows that they're coming from the deep South rather than the up South. So there's the cotton producing regions rather than the tobacco producing regions. And when you look at the states that have the most slaves, were the first states to secede. And states like Maryland and Delaware and Missouri and Kentucky, all of them are slave-owning states, but those 4 states, stayed with the Union during the Civil War. They did not join the Confederacy. And that's in part because although they are technically southern states and they are slave states, slavery is not as crucial to their economy. And slaves make up a much smaller percentage of their population. So they are not as committed to slavery and sustaining slavery. And they could imagine, living without it. Whereas the more dependent a state is on slavery, the more likely they are to join the Confederacy. They feared what Lincoln and the Republicans would do. And here, chronology and dates are important to historians to understand that if these states begin leaving in December of 1860, but Lincoln doesn't actually become president until March of 1861, that their reasons for leaving have nothing to do with anything that Lincoln did as president, because they didn't even wait for him to become president to see what he would do, right? So it's not a reaction to anything that Lincoln did, or because Lincoln was trying to take their slaves, then they revolted and had to defend themselves against Northern aggression. They didn't even wait. And Lincoln said, I'm not going to interfere with slavery in your states. So their actions are really preemptive. We're going to do this. We're going to secede before they can do anything, anticipating it, and maybe precipitating it. That is, as a result of trying to secede, they started a war. And as a result of the war, slavery is going to be abolished. If you didn't have that war and Southern congressmen and senators were still in Congress, they would have been in the minority, that is, that the Republican Party controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, but they would not have enough votes to either abolish slavery through an amendment. An amendment requires that 2/3 of the states agree to the amendment before it can become a part of the Constitution. So by starting the war, this gives Lincoln additional powers that presidents don't normally have. This is what the Emancipation Proclamation is. It's an executive order given to the military that as they move to the South to free slaves as they go. This is why, the country's suddenly recognized June 19th as a holiday. That's when the Union Army finally reaches Galveston, Texas. So as the army is marching, they are freeing the slaves. If there was no war and there's no Union Army in the South, then that would not have taken place. So they set in motion a series of events that is ultimately going to lead to the thing they feared the most. They elect Jefferson Davis as their president. And then after shots are fired at Fort Sumter, they moved the capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. And this is why the war is going to be so bloody and take so long, because Richmond, Virginia is just about 100 miles from from Washington, D.C. So when you put the capitals so close together, this is why the South feels they cannot afford to lose Virginia. Losing Virginia is also losing its capital. Losing Virginia is the most populous of the southern states, particularly of the white population, and the industrial resources of Virginia. So when Virginia is finally lost in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee will surrender. Right, the army, and his army is called the Army of Northern Virginia, and he will surrender that army. And that is the Confederate States. The Civil War starts on April 12th, 4:30 in the morning, when the South opens fire on this federal base out in Charleston Harbor called Fort Sumter. This is a picture of Fort Sumter here. It was commanded by Union officer Robert Anderson, who incidentally was an instructor at West Point, and the course that he taught was on the proper use of artillery. And who's on the outside firing in on him is General P.T. Beauregard, a former student. So that always what kind of student would all open fire on their professor? So like I said, they knew each other. Lincoln was very clever in manipulating the South into a position where they had to fire the first shot, because South Carolina was the first state to secede, and they claimed they were part of their own country, the Confederate States of America, no longer part of the United States of America. Yet there's this federal fort, this federal base right there in the harbor. So if they let that base remain, then their claim to being an independent country might be brought into question. And so Lincoln announced that I'm just going to send supplies to reinforce the fort. No weapons. We're not going to attack the South. I'm just going to send supplies to reinforce. And on the morning of April 12th, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter. This allows Lincoln to say, we have been attacked. The South started the war. They started the fighting. They started the killing. And the North has to respond to keep the country from being broken apart. So initially, the goal of the North is to save the Union, not to end slavery, right? Later, Lincoln would argue that ending slavery is a means to the end. The way we end slavery is to defeat the Union Army. The way we can defeat the Union Army is if we free the slaves, because the slaves are used to grow the food that feeds the army. They grow the tobacco and cotton that finances the army. They used on the battlefield to move equipment, to build defenses, to bury the dead. And so they are a legitimate military objective. And so in war, you can deny the enemy anything the enemy would use to wage war. You should deny them that thing. And so he could argue that he's freeing the slaves as a military act, not as a political act. This is why the 13th Amendment will be necessary to the Constitution, because once the war is over, you can no longer, any president can't say, I'm doing this as a military act. You're not at war with anybody. So how could you be invoking military powers in peacetime? So this is why then later the amendment, the Constitution had to be amended to include the 13th Amendment, saying that no person can own another human being as a slave. And so this is what Lincoln is saying in this quote is the larger issue raised by the Civil War is, does democracy work? Right? Is this experiment with democracy that we're in, Republican democracy, free elections, does it work? Because if states are allowed to leave because they don't like the results of a free and fair election, which is what is happening in 1860. We had an election. It was a controversial election. The major issue of that election was slavery. People voted, and Lincoln won. Right? And in democracy, the definition of democracy is, ruled by the people. And if the people decide they want Lincoln, then he will become the president. If we don't accept that, then maybe democracy doesn't work. So for Lincoln, this is not just about him. This is a test of democracy itself, and whether self-rule is possible. That is self-rule, whether the people can rule themselves. Because if you don't have democracy, then this leads to some form of dictatorship. But in order for democracy to work, people have to be free to vote and participate and express their opinions, and we have to accept the outcome, whatever that outcome might be. Whichever party wins, whichever president is elected, then you accept that, understanding that you have another opportunity in a few years to either persuade your fellow Americans to take a different course or to put forward a different candidate. But that's the democratic process. Once people decide that they're not going to accept the results of an election, then democracy itself is at stake. And that's what Lincoln was saying to the country at that time. And that's a good question for us to ask ourselves even today in these divisive times. So I thank you for paying attention. I hope this was helpful and useful to you. I emphasized the main points in this presentation, and these are the things that I'm going to stress on your exams. So you might go through the slides, make flashcards, make sure you understand all the important events leading up to this. For those of you who have links to practice questions in your textbooks, you can use that. I also have a review sheet in Blackboard and access to those documents. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I invite you to come meet with me privately one-on-one during my office hours, and I'd be happy to explain things to you in more detail in person. So hope you're enjoying the course. Take care and be well.